Hey everyone, welcome into our latest Trade to Black podcast. I'm your host, Shad Dales. A big moment's happened in Washington this week where Terrence Cole has now been confirmed as the new DEA Administrator after a razor-thin 44-43 vote on July 21st. And while we don't know exactly how Cole will approach cannabis rescheduling, his confirmation means one thing for sure. The U.S. finally has a permanent decision-maker at the DEA. So that alone could have a massive global implication. Because if the United States takes meaningful steps towards reform and becomes the global leader in cannabis research and medical development, it could push other countries to follow. So today we're going to focus on that ripple effect, 5 ways U.S. reform could shape cannabis policy and really markets around the world. So with that, let's get into it. So number 1, why does the U.S. matter globally? So let's start with the obvious. The U.S. is the world's largest economy, the biggest pharmaceutical market, and still the most influential player in international drug policy. When the U.S. moves, even if it's just rescheduling cannabis to a lower drug classification, it sends a signal to governments, health regulators, and investors across the globe. And if the U.S. becomes a hub for cannabis research and clinical trials, that influence only grows stronger. We've seen this before. Changes in U.S. drug policy have historically pushed other countries to reconsider their own laws, whether it's opioid regulations, tobacco control, or even psychedelic research. So cannabis will be no different. So where do we look to? The first ripple effect would hit Europe. Germany has already legalized medical cannabis and launched its cannabis club model. But other EU nations like France, Italy, and Spain, they're all moving cautiously, waiting to see how international trade and research would develop. If the US moves forward with reform, especially if it opens pathways for FDA-approved cannabis-based medications, expect Germany to expand faster into full adult use retail, France and Italy to speed up medical cannabis programs, and EU regulators to standardize medical cannabis rules, making cross-border trade easier. In short, U.S. leadership could push Europe into its own wave of coordinated cannabis reform, especially if American biotech companies begin exporting clinical research data that European regulators can trust, and that's something they're going to want. The next major ripple effect would be felt in the land down under, in Australia. Australia's medical cannabis market is already growing, but much of its regulatory framework depends on data and clinical trials from overseas. If the U.S. becomes the global leader in cannabis research, running large-scale trials on pain management, neurological disorders, and cancer-related treatments, Australian regulators will have the evidence they need to expand approvals faster. So really, this could open doors for more local cultivation licenses, greater imports of U.S.-developed cannabis medicines, and faster movement towards adult use legalization debates within the next few years. And let's not forget, Australian investment funds are already heavily tied to U.S. cannabis companies. A U.S.-driven research boom would only strengthen those relationships. Then we move next door to Australia, and that's New Zealand, who came close to legalizing recreational cannabis in a 2020 referendum, but it failed just by a few percentage points. Public opinion has been shifting since then, but politicians have been hesitant to push the issue again without stronger international backing. So if the U.S. takes a leadership role in cannabis research, New Zealand lawmakers would have political cover to revisit reform. So why? Because they could frame it as aligning with global medical standards rather than taking an ideological gamble. U.S. research institutions like Johns Hopkins or the Mayo Clinic, they're publishing clinical evidence that would carry weight in New Zealand's health policy debates. So look for some progress in New Zealand as well. Next up, and perhaps the biggest long-term ripple, is in Asia. Thailand shocked the world by decriminalizing cannabis for medical and home use purposes, but other Asian nations have been very hesitant to follow. Countries like Japan, South Korea, and Singapore, they remain extremely conservative on drug policy. But if the U.S. establishes itself as the scientific leader in cannabis-based medicine, it will be harder for these countries to ignore medical evidence. Even gradual steps, such as allowing U.S.-approved cannabis-based pharmaceuticals, it could follow, starting in places like Japan's tightly controlled medical market. They're already shifting their views on digital assets as well, so don't overlook Japan. Thailand, meanwhile, would likely use U.S. research to strengthen its own regulations and medical export market, making it the first true cannabis trade hub in Asia, and that would open up a lot of doors. So there's our take on Asia. So now let's move south, and that is Latin America, and don't overlook it. This is where cannabis cultivation is becoming a major economic economic opportunity. Countries like Colombia, Uruguay, Lesotho, and South Africa are already exporting medical cannabis to Europe. So if the U.S. enters the global research and pharmaceutical market, it could, 1, drive new partnerships between American biotech firms and Latin American growers. 2, push African nations to standardize cultivation to meet U.S. and EU pharmaceutical standards. 3, increase global competition or low-cost, high-quality medical production. In other words, U.S. leadership would set the standards everyone else would have to meet. But of course, as we say all this, let's challenge the assumption. What if the U.S. delays reform or drags its feet under Cole's leadership? Well, with that, Europe might move ahead without U.S. involvement, leaning instead on Israel and Canada, which are already leaders in medical cannabis research. As well, Australia could deepen partnerships with Canadian and German companies. And Asia might remain stalled, waiting for clearance on global guidance. So while the U.S. leadership could accelerate reform worldwide, inaction could just as easily cause the U.S. to lose influence to countries already investing heavily in research. But don't kid yourselves, countries like Canada are already very well established regardless of the outcome. So here's the bottom line. With Cole now confirmed as DEA Administrator, the U.S. finally has the leadership in place to make decisions on cannabis reform. So whether he moves quickly or cautiously, the potential for the U.S. to become the global leader in cannabis research is very, very real, and that really could change everything. Germany, Australia, New Zealand, Thailand, and even some emerging markets in Latin America and Africa, they're all going to be watching this very closely. Because if the U.S. steps into this role, it won't just change American policy, it could rewrite the global cannabis map. And with that, we'll be tracking every move, every statement, and every ripple effect from Washington right here on the Trade to Black podcast. So really, what kind of impact do you think the U.S. would have if they reschedule cannabis on the global market? Let us know by leaving your comments below. As usual, love to get your feedback. If you like this content we produce, make sure to give it a like, smash on that bell for all notifications. If you haven't done so already, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We'd appreciate it here at Trade to Black. Some interesting times here in the cannabis industry. This is what we all love to talk about. With that, like I always say, stay open-minded, stay connected, and I'll see you next time on the latest Trade to Black. I'm your host, Shad Dales, and thanks again for watching.